The moment our fellow geeks, dweebs, nerds, and other unfortunates have been fervently waiting for has finally arrived. It's time for TMI, Confessionals of the Nerd Kind. And now, your hosts, Jeff Nerfherder Chandler, Jim Kaiju Baker, and Christina Yojimbo Henry. You can continue. And now, let's get on with the show. Here is TMI.
I thought last week came out good. I did want to fact check one thing from last week. I was talking about that All the Colors of Giallo DVD. It's 4 hours, not 5.
No.
I double checked.
See somebody buying this and saying, this is not 5 hours.
The runtime, according to Amazon, is 3 hours and 59 minutes. So
is this the main feature runtime, or is this with the bonus features?
I think it's all of it. Yeah.
Because what I watched was only like 88 minutes.
Yeah. But it's still, no matter how you slice it, it's a lot of Giallo trailers.
Mm-hmm. I only scratched the surface of what I've seen in terms of the full movies.
Well, I think it's just a lot of things were not widely available for a long time. That's just been the case with a lot of foreign film, foreign TV in general. And I think this is the one upside of streaming, is that they're always looking for content, right, to fill out their libraries. And so they actually are going, to overseas TV and movies to try to fill in the gaps. So you actually end up with, more opportunities to see stuff. I mean, I was talking about this with my son, there's a whole streaming service that's devoted to anime, and there's anime on like it's on Netflix, it's on HBO, it's on whatever. And when I was first getting into anime, we had to buy video cassettes that would have 2 episodes on them. There would be only a few things that were available because only a few things were brought over here and actually translated. And now, you have access to pretty much everything.
Yeah. This reminds me of like the dawn of the VCR age, when those mom and pop video stores pre-Blockbuster started popping up. And it was the same situation. The studios would probably raid their archives to put out content, to put out videos. There are things that came out like right at the dawn of video that you never saw again. Like once that initial pressing was gone, like all you could find was that ancient copy to rent in the video store if you were lucky. Mm-hmm. So It kind of reminds me of that. The brand new world is opening up to us. And there's stuff that I would have never imagined that I'm just seeing pop up on my, recommended likes on Amazon Prime.
This is I think the one positive of streaming, because in general, I'm starting to see streaming as a very negative thing because, like I said, I've said before, everything's in silos. Like it's harder to discover stuff. The way the algorithms are set up, if you don't ask for something specific, it's hard to find like new things. But the fact that like there's so much more exposure to foreign cinema and like foreign TV, especially, I think is a good thing. Yeah,
and the fact that it's popular, that people seem to be embracing it. Like Squid Game is the most obvious example. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a positive trend. Speaking of foreign entertainment, nice segue.
The very nice segue.
Yeah, that's what's on tap this week. We are covering an Oscar nominee for Best Picture. Unfortunately, did not win. We did discuss this at the end of the episode last week, but we are covering Drive My Car. We normally dubiously watch something that's 3 hours long, going into it knowing that it's such a long movie. But sometimes a runtime is either warranted or not even noticeable. Mm-hmm. And this may be the case with Drive My Car.
I definitely think that's the case here. And I think one of the most interesting things to me about this film is that this came from a short story by Haruki Murakami. The main sort of essence of the story, this character Kafuku, who's he's got glaucoma in his left eye, right? He's an actor. His wife dies. He needs a driver. Those things are all present in the story, although they're a little bit different. The elements are a little bit different. The story is only about 38 pages long. So it's very, it's just a slender little thing. Ultimately, the story is not really at all about his relationship with Misaki at all, like it is in the film. It's that relationship is more centered. In the story, it's really more about his relationship with Takatsuki and sort of coming to grips with his wife's affairs. So
now, is this Takatsuki? You kind of schooled me on what's the name of that K-pop band? It's like, is this guy from a boy band in Japan? Did they take him hostage from some boy band and put him in this movie?
So this look, what you might think of as like the K-pop look, because it's also been popular in Japan for some time because they have J-pop stars.
Yeah.
So, and yes, a lot of young actors do look like that. He does look like a lot of young Japanese actors and a lot of young Korean actors especially have that look, that very like smooth sort of model look.
Because you're suspicious of him because of this, and this might be just me, but you're suspicious of him the moment you see him. Like, this guy is not on the up and up. Look at him. I was right.
So it's interesting again, because in the story, Takatsuki is much older. He's like middle-aged. He's not quite as old as Kafuku, but
really, because that's like part of the crux of what's going on in the movie.
Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting.
And like I said, the basic elements are there, but they're different. Like in the story, his wife actually had uterine cancer. She didn't die suddenly from a brain hemorrhage. And the storytelling aspect, like he drew from another story that's in the same collection. The collection is called Men Without Women. And there's a story called Scheherazade, and it's about a man who has a relation, like a very mostly physical relationship with a woman, but every time they have sex, she tells him some strange story. So you could tell that the director Ryosuke Hamaguchi, he took elements from a couple of stories in Murakami's collection and then incorporated them into like this frame, which was present in the short story, I Drive My Car.
Now, because I read that they tried to get the rights to the Beatles song, Drive My Car, and were unsuccessful. Does this figure into the story, the song?
No, not at all.
No.
And in the story, though, actually, the only music that's mentioned is Kafuku likes to listen to Beethoven string quartets when he's not listening to his lines. When he's not rehearsing his lines in the car.
Now, that's probably part of what gives this movie its length, is all the rehearsal footage of the Uncle Vanya play that they are working on. And far from being like a diversion from the plot, it really, I think, accentuates it instead. So because you get a sense of who these characters are, the actors.
The interesting thing about the way Uncle Vanya is used is that, especially whenever Kafuku gets in the car, it's always on a line that's somehow relevant to his current moment.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. It's like the exact thing that he needs to hear at that moment.
If you were just to give this a bird's eye view, this Kafuku, he is an actor / director, and he's been tasked with directing a special festival performance in Hiroshima, Uncle Vanya. And this is one of his favorite works. And unfortunately, his wife dies, and he finds out she's been having an affair. And one of the actors who signs on to the festival that is under his watch is the very person that his wife had an affair with. There's some salacious drama going on, but it's substantive as well. I will admit it did take a couple of nights for me to get through it because of its length. I can't usually just sit all at once unless it's in a theater for a 3-hour movie. But I was very much looking forward to coming back to it. It was not a drag whatsoever. So if you are turned off by the length or the fact that it's a foreign film, please don't be.
It's interesting too. What I think is interesting about the way the film is organized is that the first 40 minutes are fundamentally a prologue. Like you don't even see the titles
I know.
until 40 minutes into the film. So there's this long segment where you see Kafka's relationship with his wife, and you see him discover the affair. You see how their life kind of continues after the discovery of that affair. You find out that they had a daughter who died. Um, and it's interesting because the way it's constructed, it does feel almost like a completely different mini movie, right at the beginning of the film. And then it takes this step to move on to Hiroshima, where you see the incidents that happened at the festival, which is 2 years later, according to the timeline of the film. It's just very interesting the way they constructed it. And then, of course, the stories that his wife, Otto, tells him are obviously a huge metaphor for her relationship with him.
Yes, yes. And so that's how the movie opens, with them in bed, and she's narrating the story, and it turns out that she is a writer. She's a screenwriter, and this is how she gets her ideas. And she often forgets the next day, and is up to him to kind of relate what she's told him, because obviously these stories make a great impression on him. And you get a sense of what's going on in the beginning because you see this, but he kind of explains it a little better to the audience a little bit further on, once he's in the car with the J-pop guy who has slept with his wife. Takatsky. Kafuku always gives the sense, and he gave this with his wife, that he has one up because he knows something that the other doesn't know that he knows. Because he walked in on them and silently left the apartment because he was supposed to catch a plane. The flight got canceled. He goes back home, and then he caught his wife in the act, but she didn't know that he was there. He just kind of slipped out. But as he's telling him in the car, how his wife would write stories, and she never ended this particular story that opens the film about a girl who is obsessed with somebody in her high school class, a boy. She goes and sneaks into his house, and then sneaks into his room, and usually leaves something and takes something. Nobody knows. Kafuku never knew how the story ended.
Well, there's a very devastating scene, which is then the last scenes of the two of them together, and she's telling the story, and she's saying that the girl has never done anything particularly untoward in this boy's bedroom, right? But on this day, she's decided to masturbate in his room while he's not at home. And while she's doing this, she has this revelation that in a past life she was a lamprey, but she didn't want to eat the fish, so she clung to this rock, and she slowly starved to death, while she was sort of being buffeted by the water. And you see this look on Kafuku's face where he realizes he is the rock and she is the lamprey, and he's killing her. That's what she's telling him. She's telling him that he's killing her slowly in some way. And obviously, this is a terribly painful revelation. Part of the reason I think why is because he is in some ways emotionally closed off. You see him compartmentalize that moment when he walks in on his wife with Takatsky.
Yeah, that was disappointing because I was expecting some kind of lashing out of anger, or, at least making a noise to indicate that he was there. But then you learn that this is not the first time that this has happened. He's probably done this before. So he's resigned to it by now.
And he just sort of looks and he sees it, and you see him sort of take it in. He takes whatever he's feeling, he puts it away, he shuts the door. That's it. It's like it's just gone into this room.
Yeah, it's like the maid walking in and not knowing that the couple is still there. It's like, oops, I'll come back later.
Mm-hmm. And this is why it's interesting that Uncle Vanya is the frame for the story, because Kafuku says one of the reasons why he didn't want to play Vanya himself, even though it's a role that he knows well in this particular production, is because when you say his lines, it drags out the real you. This feeling that he has that if he gives himself over to the play, which is what you have to do as an actor, that something painful is going to be taken out of him.
Yeah. And you see it happen to him because after his wife passes, which is just a random event, you see him break down during the performance. Obviously, he doesn't want that to happen again.
I think what's interesting in the film is that his motivation for casting Takatsky, particularly in the role of Vanya, I think his motivations are murky. You know?
Yeah, because Takatsky, he doesn't want it. He's like, this is for an older man. I don't think the part fits me. He's like, it fits you. You will play it. And I think he takes some pleasure in that as well.
Well, that's the thing. It's in the story, he becomes friends with Takatsky on purpose because he wants to get vengeance on him somehow. He thinks that if he becomes friends with this man and that he'll find some fatal flaw and then he'll be able to exploit it and hurt him in some way. But then he ends up liking him, as a person. They actually become friends. And then he, I think because he starts liking him, he sort of cuts off the relationship and then just never speaks to him again. But his thirst for vengeance sort of dissipates and goes away. And I think what's interesting in the film is you can't tell, is he trying to make Takatsky a better person? Is he trying to make him confront what he's done? Is it a kind of vengeance where he's, trying to punish Takatsky by putting him in a situation where he's not able to fulfill the role, where he's not able to do this work in an honest way? Is he trying to humiliate him? I feel like there's a lot that's potentially
yeah. I think maybe
there.
He had it as a key. He was using him as a key to further understand Otto as well. I got that impression when they're having the conversation in the car and Takatsky finishes the story. The girl sneaks into the room and somebody walks in on her and it's not one of the family members. It's an intruder. That probably was the worst cut of all. Even worse than him walking in on them in the beginning is this guy knew the end of the story. And that was such an intimate moment normally between the two of them. Her coming up with these stories, and because he tells Takatsky, this is what we did. She would tell me these stories. She would forget them, and then I would read them back. And he cherished that. And the fact that somebody else had that moment with her, that was worse for me than having him walk in on them in the beginning.
When he's like, I never find out the end. He's like, oh, no, I know the end.
Oh, I know the end.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this guy. And this must be the quickest beating in cinema history. Takatsky is very famous. And if somebody recognizes him in a restaurant, and you see it happen a couple of times in the film, they have to take their camera out and take a picture of him. And there's an aside reference that he had a scandal with an underage girl as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. He's clearly a person who's very, very troubled.
Yes.
Who has a lot of issues. My son was watching this with me and he was like, he's a scumbag.
Yeah, I thought the same thing.
He was really, at first he was like, I feel a little bad for Takatsky, because he seems somewhat helpless in a way. And also what's interesting to me is that his respect for Kafuku seems real.
Yeah.
I think that's what's really interesting about it, is that I think he genuinely respects Kafuku, but at the same time he's done this phenomenally disrespectful thing.
He feels no guilt towards that.
Yeah.
He feels none, and he lies to Kafuku's face. So I didn't like him. I did not feel sympathetic. He gets very angry whenever somebody takes his picture in public. And somebody is, as they're dining one night, somebody is snapping his picture with a phone, and he says, excuse me. He runs off for no more than like a minute, 2 minutes, and then runs back because, I took care of it.
It's funny because I thought in that moment, I was like, oh, he punched that. Like, I thought maybe he punched the guy
or
in the
took
face
his phone.
And, took his phone. That's what I thought. I was like, oh, he punched him and took his phone. But then it comes out later that this man was beaten half to death. And then he dies in the hospital. Yeah. And I'm like, did he even have time to
I know.
To do that kind of beating? That seems crazy.
And especially somebody looking like he does. Don't judge a book by its cover, I know, but Is he capable of beating someone to death in like a minute?
Well, I mean, certainly his fury would indicate that, because he's so angry about it. I mean, he's just
Yeah.
insane with rage every time it happens. And Kafka actually talks to him about that at the beginning, because the first time they go to a bar, someone else tries to take his photo, and Takatsuki gets up and goes over and tries to confront the person who's taken his photo. And Kafka basically tells him, that he needs to like make good choices.
Mhm.
That he needs to like calm down and, be a little more thoughtful.
Which obviously he doesn't take to heart.
No.
I don't know how long we've been talking on this now, but we've not yet mentioned once Misaki, who is Fuku's lifeline at the end. Surrogate daughter?
Yeah.
Could that be more obvious toward the end because she is the same age?
As his daughter who died.
As daughter would have been. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, there's some little changes here in the story. Her mom was abusive, but she died suddenly in a car accident because she was drinking, not because, their house collapsed because of a landslide, which is like just a devastating story. The idea that your house would fall on you and you'd have to crawl out to survive. But one of the things about this movie is that it's really, in a very, very large way, less about what's actually said and more about sort of the space and the silence between people and like what happens in that silence. Misaki is a very quiet person. She spends most of her time she drives and she listens.
Which is great because she doesn't speak of her first few scenes. She's just there to drive. Maybe she says hello, just one word answers. But she slowly, as the movie unfolds, begins to unfold, herself. You don't get a sense of her until Kafuku gets a sense of her. She starts as you not even noticing she's there, which is really what her job is. And then you start to see her just as he does.
And I think so interesting the choice that they made to have the first time where she really reveals herself by taking him to the garbage incinerator facility, which is, of course,
because she's taking him to see the sights, right?
Yeah.
I was expecting to see the gang from Toy Story 3 all holding hands and slowly sliding into the incinerator in there.
But what's interesting about it is, first of all, the way that it's shot, but second, the facility itself does not look at all the way you think of it as an incinerator facility in the US, right? It's like beautifully designed, like there's all this glass and there's like this long breezeway and it goes up to the sea. It actually
it's like a public facility. You can go in there and watch it.
It's so interesting because it is sort of, you start to see it through her eyes, where it's sort of like strangely beautiful and calming. And this is a place that she's taken him to because this is the first place where she went after she came from her town in Hokkaido. Her house collapsed. Her mother died in the house. She survived. She got in the car and she just started driving. And Hiroshima is where her car stopped. And then she got a job. And the only thing she knew how to do was drive. So she got a job driving a garbage truck.
And this is why this location, we assume why she brings him there when she's thinking of things to show him. And at first, he doesn't want a driver because this is how he unwinds. He still talks to his wife while he's driving because he's listening to her recite the Uncle Vanya lines and he reads them back. So she's only recorded her lines so he could run lines with her while he's driving. And he doesn't want to lose that. He tries to fight it at first where the festival organizers are like, no. So he's like, okay. And then he's slowly opens up to the idea because she is such a good driver. He's like, it's not even like I'm in a car. She drives so well. And then you find out it's because she used to drive her mother who would beat her if she went over a bump in the road and woke her up. She's very cognizant of potholes and stuff like that. So yeah, she is a perfect driver.
The interesting thing about the festival organizers is they insist on the basis of the story that a previous resident got in an accident, but this is obviously about him because they say, oh, well, all of our artists have to be driven, but then Takatsuki drives his own car. And Kafuku says to him at one point, like, you have your own car? Like, you drive it? And it's not said, but it's very clear that they know about his glaucoma, that he probably shouldn't be driving, and they're insisting that he be driven. And they use this story kind of as a way to save face, right? Without revealing this personal thing about him and that they know it. So they insist that he takes this driver who he doesn't want at first, because the car is some kind of sanctuary for him.
The festival itself, the staging of Uncle Vanya, is multilingual. So there's various actors speaking various languages. So the audience obviously are not going to know everything that's being said, but there's subtitles played behind the stage in various languages. So if you're Japanese, which most of this audience will be, you can read what's being said. So I just think that that's a fascinating setup.
And weirdly relevant to actually our second feature, Night on Earth.
Yeah.
Because Night on Earth is multiple languages, and Jarmusch, of course, does not know all those languages. And he's actually talked about his process there, directing actors who are speaking a language he doesn't understand. So it ended up being much more connected to the story even than I remembered. But yeah, I love Yoon-soo, who's the male festival organizer, and his wife Yuna. They're Korean. That scene in their home is so delightful. Like, if you don't fall in love with the two of them after that scene, I just think your heart's made of stone. They're such a well-matched couple. It's a very funny scene. It's very charming. Misaki actually reveals something about herself even in that moment, because she leaves the table to go play with the dog.
That's the first time she's allowed into the greater world of the film outside of the car, outside of the driver's seat of the car, when she's invited to dinner. And she kind of breaks character there of the subservient one, just sitting silently as she leaves the table. And I thought to myself, where's she going? Why is she getting up and leaving? And it's just to play with the dog, to sit on the floor and play with the dog.
There's a lot of subtlety here, and I think if you don't know a ton about Japanese culture and sort of social norms, some of this stuff will go over your head. It's not to your detriment, I think, but some stuff is helpful to know. It's very significant, actually, that Takatsuki asks Kafuku to meet him in the bar the first time. He says, I want to talk to you. Can we meet in the bar? And then Kafuku, through circumstance, ends up picking up the check. And Takatsuki is like, oh no, but I asked you. This is actually, by not picking up the check, Takatsuki has actually committed a huge social faux pas. If you ask somebody out in Japan for drinks or dinner, it's on you. That's how it is. There's no splitting the check. The other person's not going to get it. It's socially, you're supposed to pay for.
So you're supposed to hate this kid. Right?
Yes.
That's what they're telling you.
It's really, really rude what he's done by not picking up the check.
So I didn't know that, and I still hated him.
There's also one thing that is pretty significant. This is like on the other end of what his relationship is with Kafuku. And this is why I say I do think he really does respect Kafuku. So obviously, Japanese people bow to each other. They, you bow when you meet somebody, you bow when you're leaving. There's other circumstances where you might bow. And normally it's like almost like a little head dip, right? If you're on this more or less the same social level, like somebody like Takatsuki would bow slightly deeper to Kafuku just because he's older and because he's the director of the play, but he wouldn't bow super deep. But at the end of the film, when he is taken away by the police, and this is the last time you see Takatsuki leaving the theater, he bows. He does almost like a full 90-degree bow. This is an incredibly respectful bow that he gives to Kafuku at the end here. Like, he is really telling him something without telling him with this bow. It is such a deeply respectful action that he does there at the end. See, you're not necessarily going to miss anything as an American, but if you know this, you know that he's trying to communicate something to Kafka in that moment.
And they're just little asides. Speaking about the multilingual aspect of the production, the rehearsals are fascinating just because there's several translators present that are communicating what the director is saying to the actors and what the actors are saying to the directors. Because Kafuku he can speak English, and so can the Mandarin girl. He can't speak Mandarin, so he's communicating with her in English. And then Takatsuki can only speak Japanese. He can't speak Mandarin, so he doesn't know what she's saying to him.
He can't speak Mandarin or English. Yeah.
And what's fascinating, during the rehearsals, in order for each other to know when their line is done, because they have no way of knowing that, they knock on the table. It's almost like saying over when you're on the CB. And a little bit later, you assume that Takatsuki is hooked up with the Mandarin girl because they show up together. Kafuku asks him, well, how does that work if you don't understand? And he kind of just brushes it off. Yeah, you're asking yourself, how does that work if they don't understand each other?
Actually, it's more that Kafka is confronting him about what really happened, because Takatsuki's like, oh, well, she was just a little, feeling a little out of place, so I lent her an ear. And Kafka's like, how can you lend her an ear? You don't speak Mandarin or English. And he's like, I know what happened, okay? It's like, I'm an adult. I need you to try to protect. He's almost like a teenager who's been caught. But yeah, this is a guy who cannot control himself in any sense.
Yeah. And the other odd thing is that Kafka's car, the steering wheel is not on the side where all the other steering wheels are, because their steering wheels are on the right side. But his car, it's on the left side, as it is, in the US here.
Because he has a Swedish car. Yeah.
So that would explain it.
He actually has a Saab. It's an imported car. I sometimes wonder if that's disorienting for Misaki, right? Because the steering wheel is on the left side, but she also has to drive on the left side.
Obviously, it's legal to drive that car.
Yeah.
I've never seen anybody here with the car with the steering wheel on the right-hand side, because I'm not sure if it's legal here. Probably not. We don't like anything foreign, right?
When I was in the UK and just being in a cab where they were driving on the left side of the road, I kept thinking we were going to get in an accident. Like it was so very disorienting to me to have the cars on the opposite side of the road.
All this is playing out. Misaki has been driving him back and forth, and you're learning, and as we mentioned before, you're learning as this is going on about her background and her mother. Takatsuki has been taken away by the police, because you find out that the guy that he ran off to chase, who took his picture, has been beaten to death. He was in the hospital and now he's dead, and the police have come to pick up Takatsuki. And he just kind of accepts his fate. He goes along with the police. He's like, yes, it's me. And so that's when Kafuku is given the ultimatum by the festival organizers that if he doesn't play Vanya, then they have no play, that they're not going to consider casting anybody else. At that point, he's like, okay, I've got to think about this. He asks Misaki to show him where she's grown up.
He's like, take me to your village. And I'm like, they're going to drive to Hokkaido from Hiroshima. Like, this is not a short drive.
I know, because it was like, this is about how long it takes me to drive to Florida. The time, the time that you see them go from point A to point B.
Hokkaido is an island on the north.
Yeah, because they have to get on a ferry at one point.
Yeah, it's considered very country by people who live on the main island of Japan. There's been talk for years about building a train that runs directly to Hokkaido, but hasn't manifested yet.
I know Hokkaido because that's where Godzilla is spotted in King Kong versus Godzilla. But yeah, so they make it to her house, to the site of her, what's left of her house, because she's already told him that it's been buried by a landslide. And the ruins of the house, they're still there. And she, brings them through the snow, and they trudge up the hill to see the house. And that's where they embrace. Oh,
yeah. I mean, that scene when they're in the car and she's first talking about how it's the first time he's sitting next to her in the car, not in the back seat. He tells her the story of how the day his wife died, she said before he left, can we talk when you come home? And he drove around because he was reluctant to go home and confront what he knew she was going to say to him. And when he went home, he found her on the floor, and he called the ambulance, but she did die. And he felt guilty. He felt that he had actually killed her by through emotional avoidance, that he had actually killed her by not being at home. Because if he had been at home when she collapsed, there might have been more that could have been done for her. And then Misaki tells the story of her house collapsing, and that she crawled out and she knew her mother was inside, but she left her there. And she felt very complicated about that because it was her mother, but her mother had abused her. And the scene when they're in the car and they're talking about that, and he says, if I was your father, I'd put my arms around you and say that it's going to be okay. It's a very moving moment. But then he says, but I'm not your father. And the fact of the matter is you killed your mother and I killed my wife. It's such an emotionally revelatory moment, but it's so interesting to me because I can't help thinking about the way this would be in the hands of like an American director or an American, American performances. It'd just be a completely different thing, where we're so emotive in film. Everything has to be a big, big emotion. But to me, this is so powerful because it's not a huge emotion.
Right. It is at the same time.
It is, but it's
the meaning of this embrace is very potent. Going back to the Oto's story that you hear finished, the car conversation is happening with Takatsuki. I loved the reveal that the girl in the story sees a surveillance camera. So now she's caught. Is this, a reference to him knowing about her affairs? So there's all these layers to interpret.
Layers.
Yeah. And I appreciated that, with the US production, if this was in somebody else's hands here, it would have to be spelled out for you.
Yeah.
Largely for an American audience. That's what they want, but you don't get that here. And it's refreshing.
Well, that's what I mean when I say that this movie is really largely about silence. There's so much that's not said. There's so much that's not directly communicated. There's so much that, isn't completely spelled out, but still at the end, when Yuna gives the final monologue in Uncle Vanya to Vanya, now played by Kafku on stage.
Yes, he decided to go ahead with it.
She gives the little monologue about, how we have to live.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what has happened to us, no matter how we've suffered, we have to live. And it's so powerful because he doesn't speak, but you can see him again
absorbing the lines,
absorbing what she's saying.
And we will know peace from this point on. That's what it's telling you.
Right.
The very end, talking about stuff left unsaid.
Mm-hmm.
So you see Misaki in Korea with his car, leaving a grocery store and assumingly going back home because that's where she lives now.
Yeah.
Does he live there as well?
Maybe not. Maybe.
Is that why she's in his car? Has he given her his car?
See,
and she's lived on her own.
I interpret it that he gave her the car.
Right.
That the car had served the purpose for him that he needed, and that he no longer needed the car for that purpose, and that he'd passed it to her.
Or is she going home and bringing dad his groceries?
Well,
that's a nice ending.
Yeah, that's also a nice ending. But this is a beautiful kind of open to interpretation ending. Either way, it's a positive ending for her. She's happy. She's a happy person. It's clear that she's a happy person and that she's come to grips with her past. And she has her own dog now.
Yeah.
She's come to a place of peace, which is what, is communicated at the end of Uncle Vanya.
Now, it might be my eyesight, but I didn't even notice that she had a scar to begin with, because they very tellingly, she removes the mask and they have a close up of her face. And then I read a bit later, because she had a scar on her cheek and it's not there when she takes the mask off. I'm like, I didn't even see and I have a huge TV. It's like, I need glasses. I didn't even see the scar.
I did notice it the first time. And then when I was watching it with my son, he was like, oh, she's got a scar on her cheek. I mean, it's pretty obvious when she first climbs into the car because, the scar is on her left cheek and she's in the driver's seat. So you do see it pretty clearly that first time.
Now, the festival originally, talking a little bit behind the scenes, was supposed to take place in Busan.
Yeah.
And that would have been a very different movie. I think, with the zombie problem that they have in Busan.
Also would have been different from the point of view of he would have been a foreigner.
Yeah.
In Busan. Whereas, even though he's in Hiroshima, which is, he lives in Tokyo.
Like us going to a different state. It's not like he's completely out of sorts. I can absolutely see why this was nominated for Best Picture. But I can also understand why it was not declared the winner. It did have an outside chance. And even though we were talking about how Parasite opened the door for foreign films winning Best Picture, I think this was a dark horse because of the space, because of just what we were talking about, what's left unsaid. So this is not always an easy sell for American audiences, but I think it's worthy of your attention. And I'm very glad that at least it did win Best Foreign Picture. So I thought it was engrossing. I really enjoyed it. I loved the characters and I love this actor. Now, you being what else is he in? Are you familiar with his work outside of this movie?
I have not seen a ton of stuff
because I loved him in this. He was just riveting, and I think that's what's needed in this to take you along with him during the journey of this movie.
I have not seen a ton of stuff that he's been in. I've seen a couple of things. He's actually been cast in Shin Ultraman.
He has? Really?
Yes. So hopefully if Shin Ultraman ever comes to fruition, as we hope it does, because it has been delayed, mostly because of the pandemic, we'll see him again.
Yet another selling point for me in Shin Ultraman right there. So yeah, I really loved it. I'm going to go 4 buckets on Drive My Car.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little higher. I am a Murakami fan, even though he doesn't... it's always interesting to me about the way Murakami's work is interpreted. He's not a great writer of women, but he's such a compelling writer. This is not my favorite thing that he's written, but the stories in this collection, Men Without Women, are beautiful. If you're inclined to read short stories, please go and get it. I'm going to say 4.5.
4.5?
Yeah. If you're an American and you're not familiar with Murakami's work, he's written some very large novels. But the first book I actually read by him, which is funny because I do read a lot of Japanese writers, was What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. And that is because I am a runner. I think every runner reads this book. It's nonfiction. It's sort of semi-autobiographical, where he talks about sort of all these experiences he's had being a long-distance runner. I think that even if you're not a runner, you might enjoy it. But he's an interesting writer. You feel that sense of space that's present in this movie.
It's funny that you say even if you're not a runner, you'd enjoy, because the actress that played Misaki couldn't drive. She didn't have her driver's license when she was cast. And now this is available on HBO Max. I would assume at least 1 or 2 other streaming services for those of you who have access to it. So yeah, seek it out if you can see it. So let's go to the concession stand, and we're going to be getting back in the car once we get some food with Night on Earth.
Of utmost importance to every drive-in theater patron is this parched, dry area located at the back of the throat. One of the best treatments we know is a frosty, fresh, bubbling, cold drink, such as you can find at this theater's refreshment center. And we have all of your family's favorite flavors. So for the dry, parched area in the back of your throat, visit your refreshment center for an ice-cold drink. A treat and a treatment.
All right, we're back, and we're talking about Jim Jarmusch's Night on Earth. Now, this was released originally in December of 1991. And this was the heyday of my discovery of independent film. This was at a time when I was going to, and we have a theater locally here in upstate New York, in Rhinebeck, New York, called Upstate Films. And I would probably go every weekend to whatever was playing there. This was around the time of My Own Private Idaho, Crying Game, classic 90s cinema like this. And this came out right in the middle of it. And I saw this in the theater. Probably didn't play at Upstate Films when it was released, probably several months later. But I remember seeing this in the cinema. And the Italy section in particular made a very big impression. Roberto Benigni. The first time I had seen him, because I hadn't seen Down by Law.
Oh, you hadn't seen Down by Law?
I hadn't seen Down by Law. I saw that after this. But yeah, Night on Earth, I loved it. This was a favorite of mine in the 90s. When it came out on VHS, I rented it quite a few times. So I'm very familiar with this film.
Yeah, I have the Criterion edition of this. I'm a huge Jarmusch fan. I mentioned last week that I can't believe that I haven't made you guys watch Jarmusch film for this show. Yeah, I think I like his work because he's always seemed in a way like a European director, not like an American director. He's just has a completely different kind of energy from a lot of American directors. And I think it comes through in some ways. His films feel like foreign films, even though he's American. There's so many things to love about this movie. We start right from the beginning with the Tom Waits soundtrack.
Now there's two phases of Tom Waits. His early, his early less scratchy voiced days, which I'm very fond of. And then we get into is what I like to call his Rolf the Dog phase. You can picture Rolf the Dog or a Muppet singing these songs. I can only imagine the shape his vocal cords are in after a recording session.
This soundtrack comes out between Frank's Wild Years and Bone Machine. And I think of this as a really transitional period for Tom Waits, where he's going from that sort of jazzy, bluesy, like Rain Dogs type music he did at the beginning of his career to like Bone Machine is pretty experimental. Black Rider, which came after this, is super experimental. And in a lot of ways, actually, the music for this reminds me of Alice, which he was writing around the same time as a play, but it didn't come to fruition. Then it was later released as an album. That's actually one of my favorite albums of his. The sound of this film to me is very much going into like that second phase of Tom Waits' career, where it has that slightly twisted carnival sound that he, really embraced later in his career. He, of course, had been in Down by Law with Roberto Benigni and John Lurie.
And hopefully soon we'll talk about his performance in Dracula. Renfield.
Honestly, like one of the best things about that movie, no lie. Like he's really good as Renfield.
This is the story of 5 different cities and 5 different taxi cab rides. Because of the time differences, they take place at different times, but yet at the same time.
When you go to each clock, which is how he shows the transitions, and the clock will actually wind back to the same moment that it was at the beginning of the movie. This is such an amazingly well cast film that's actually really important because, with the exception of the Italy segment, the segment that takes place in Rome with Benigni, nothing super dramatic happens in these caps. They're really, really slice of life stories. It's just capturing the little moment. And
it could be argued that Helsinki is pretty dramatic.
What I mean about dramatic is kind of what I was talking about when we were talking about Drive My Car, in the American sense of, imagine an American director who is not Jim Jarmusch doing 5 things that happen in cars. There would be a drug deal. There would be like a car crash.
There would be an actual murder.
There would be so many horrifically dramatic, escalating things happening in each of these cabs. And this is what I mean when I say Jarmusch, I think, has a very European sensibility, where he's perfectly content for you to have not too much happen. In a sense.
I was mistaken. I didn't think that we'd ever covered an anthology film before on this show, but we have. Twilight Zone, the movie, was an anthology.
I wasn't here
film.
when you guys
you weren't.
that.
You weren't here for that. But very importantly, with that, and a lot of anthology films, that was made by several different directors. This is not. This is Jim Jarmusch all the way through, and they all seem like little Jim Jarmusch movies, regardless of the language.
In the opening sequence, which takes place in LA, you have Winona Ryder and Jenna Rollins. Jenna Rollins, who is, of course, a legend. And as it happens, this was the first film where she accepted a role after her husband John Cassavetes,
John
who's also
Cassavetes.
her artistic partner, had passed away. So this was the first film she did after Cassavetes' death. So Jarmusch said he was overwhelmed with gratitude that she agreed to do this. And it's a very low-key part. She plays a casting director who's clearly trying to make some very demanding person happy. She has a cell phone, which was very out of place in 1991. But Winona Ryder is playing her cab driver, and Winona Ryder is so small. She has like almost like a short round quality.
Well, she's sitting on a phone book, so she can see out the windshield.
And she's got the little water pistol in her cash box. Like she seems very young. It's not just her size, it's her kind of attitude that she conveys. She comes across as a very young person.
Now, this is, interestingly enough, because I love this movie so much, I feel that the opening vignette is the weakest for me.
Yeah.
I don't like this half as much as I do any of the others here. I think she's trying too hard to be a little grungy. It's like she's almost like she's channeling some little kid in a 30s or 40s movie. She stopped short at saying, "Go suck an egg," and spitting on the ground. She tries very hard to look grungy and oily. And
well,
tough.
I mean, to be fair, somebody put that on her.
Yeah.
That was a decision that was made by Jarmusch probably and the makeup director. It is probably, of the five, the weakest segment, and yet it goes by very quickly, which I think is one of the fascinating things about this. Is you're so absorbed in each little narrative, all of a sudden you're like, wait, it's over, now we're going to another thing, and then he immediately establishes you in the next city and the next set of characters.
It's almost like, okay, we've gotten the big star turn out of the way. Now the movie can start,
Sure. I mean, you think about 1991, Winona Ryder was one of the biggest stars in the country, especially for independent film.
Yeah.
Her draw, to bring people into the theater would have been, exponentially greater than most of the other actors, even though there's nothing but amazing independent actors in this film.
And I remember the video box. She was front and center on the video box. I don't know if there was any other pictures on the video box but hers. So yeah, she was the selling point. Though it's a means to an end, right? I understand she's there, but
it's it's a little story about Jenna Rollins, who plays as casting director, and she's wants to she's got to find someone to play this part.
And of course, where this is going before anybody else does. I think I have an idea, Marty, that 18-year-old you're looking for.
At the end, she asks Winona Ryder's character if she wants to be in this film. And she's like, no, I want to be a mechanic.
Yeah. My life is going pretty well now. I don't want to mess it up.
And it's so funny because Jenna Rollins' character just absolutely dumbfounded. Like, everybody wants to be famous. Everybody wants to be an actor. Why wouldn't you want this? She accepts the decision. Obviously, there's nothing else she can do, but it is pretty funny. A little segment can ease you into this film. And the next one is in New York. And of course, Giancarlo Esposito, who is just always freaking amazing. I mean, has he ever done a bad work?
No. And this is probably the first time I was really aware of him as well. So every time I've seen him ever since Night on Earth, Yo-Yo. Every time I see him, it's Yo-Yo. That's what I think of.
You think of him in that hat.
Yeah. Even on Breaking Bad. I don't know if you ever watched Breaking Bad, but he's a pretty heavy character on that. And I still can't think of anything but Yo-Yo.
This was directly based on an experience that Jim Jarmusch had.
With somebody like Helmut?
Yes, with somebody like Helmut. So he said he was on the Upper West Side. He called it, he flagged down a cab. He got in the cab. The man was foreign. He was struggling with the automatic transmission of the car for some reason.
Did Jim Jarmusch drive?
Drove the cab and paid the guy at the end of it because he was trying to get where he was going. And he's like, I'm never going to get there if I let this guy drive the cab. So this is the story that Jarmusch tells on the Criterion Collection edition, there's like a hour-long Q&A where he actually answers a bunch of questions from his fans who sent in questions. And this is one of the questions that he answered. So this was a true story that he turned into this segment.
And I'm sure that this was discussed on the Criterion disc as well. But they were afraid that a cab would actually stop for Yo-Yo, because obviously these cabs are part of the shot, but they're not in on it. As he's trying to hail a cab in the script, it's like he can't get a cab. It's like, well, what if somebody pulls over and picks him up? It's going to ruin the shot. Nobody did. Mm-hmm. He really couldn't get a cab.
Jarmusch talked about how incredibly difficult it was to film this movie because you have to tow the cars. Obviously they're not really driving, and this is none more apparent than in the Benigni scene where Benigni cannot stop talking with his hands, and he's like not even touching the steering wheel at various points. And I'm very sympathetic to this because as we talked about last week, I am Italian. I do talk with my hands. I was actually forced by my 6th grade teacher to sit on my hands. Because she became so annoyed at my Italian gesticulating. But they had to tow the actors in the cars, and Jarmusch said it was an incredibly complex setup because they have these rails on the sides of the cars so they can fix the lighting for the actors. And basically once the actors were in, they were in, because it took like 20 minutes to get them out again, every time they wanted to get out of the car. So he said that he didn't know what he was thinking, deciding to do a movie that was based completely in cars.
And I did read that because of this, they needed 2 of the same taxi in every city so they could film, wide shots and then have the setup where they're filming the actors inside the cars. So they needed 2 of the same car for each location that they were in. But
and Armin Mueller-Stahl plays Helmut. Who is the cab driver that Yo-Yo pushes into the passenger seat because he's frustrated with his driving. He's actually, but he's not really a driver. He's a clown.
He's a clown, yes. Mm-hmm. And he plays the flutes as well, which amuses Yo-Yo to no end, which I'm sure Helmut is very satisfied with, because this is what he wants to do. He wants to make people laugh. And once Yo-Yo finds out his name, Helmut, your name is Helmut? It's like that'd be calling the kid Lampshade.
Mm-hmm.
And then he gets very defensive. He gets very defensive when he talks about his own name.
Yeah, and then Helmut makes fun of him. He's like the toy, like a yo-yo that goes up and down. And he's like, no, not like that. Yeah, it's such a great turnaround there.
Now, this whole exchange is so charming. And I think, and I hate to say it, but I think when Rosie Perez's character of Angela comes in, she kind of interrupts this one-on-one between Yo-Yo and Helmut. Because then it gets, I don't like profanity. And then it starts to F you, F this, F that. I'm like, I don't really like once she comes into it. I think that really robs the vignette of what was going for it previously, because you don't know the relationship. You kind of find out, okay, I think that he said that he's her brother-in-law, and then she's walking the streets of Manhattan, and he gets her back in the cab to bring her back home. So you don't really know what's going on there at the back end. And then Helmut's kind of like, oh, this is family. He's confused by it as well. But yeah, like you said, you learn that he's from East Germany. He was a circus clown. I don't know how he got a job as a cab driver, because obviously he cannot drive the cab. And this is why Yo-Yo, and he doesn't know how to get to Brooklyn, which is where Yo-Yo wants to take him back home. And so this is where it gets sinister at the end, because you don't know what happens to Helmut. I never liked how this one ended, because well, does he get back?
And you assume that eventually he'll.
Hopefully, yes, because it seems like the neighborhoods he's going through are getting worse and worse, and then it ends. But then we move on to Paris after New York, and I don't think we ever learn this driver's name.
You don't learn his name.
He's just the driver.
Yeah, by Isaac de Bancole, who is a great actor who's been in a ton of Jarmusch films. He's really, really good actor. He plays an immigrant in Paris. He's from the Côte d'Ivoire. And when you first see him, there's two Cameroonian passengers in the back who are sort of mocking him. First of all, talking about some scam they got away with. And then they're mocking him. They assume he can't speak French.
They're calling him ugly. They ask him where he's from, and he says the Ivory Coast. And then they mock him because of that. Finally, he has enough, and he kicks him out of his cab.
But then he realizes he didn't collect their fare, and he's so angry.
And then he picks up the blind girl.
Yeah, Beatrice Dalle plays this character, and she's rolling her eyes into her head like Shintaro Katsu in the Zatoichi films to indicate that she's blind.
I do like this one. He starts asking her questions because he's curious. It kind of, the roles are a little bit reversed from where he has the two passengers that are insulting him, and he's kind of borderline insulting her with his questions. You go to the movies? What can you see at the movies? And she's like, I feel the movies, and she tries to start to explain it, and then she just realizes that there's no use. You know so much. What color am I? I don't know colors. That's not important to me. Okay, where am I from? And she guesses where he's from the way that he speaks. It's like, not bad. Then he starts to respect her after that. I think a fascination starts to grow. He really starts to study her from that point in the rearview mirror as she's, adjusting herself and putting her makeup on.
That's part of the thing is that he's so curious about her. He's really paying attention to her in the backseat and not to where he's driving. He is so fascinated by her. She's quite profane too, as well, but it's in French, so apparently it's okay, right?
Yeah, that's it's a little bit better for me to take when it's in a different language. As you're saying that he's looking at her and not looking at the road, it's even more so when she gets out of the cab because, he asks her, are you all right? And she's very insulted by this. Like, I can take care of myself. And the camera's on her and you hear the car pull away and immediately crash. So you assume that he's staring at her as he's driving away. And then she kind of smiles to herself as she walks by the scene of the accident and he's arguing with whoever he crashed into. It could be viewed as the slightest of the five, but still, I really enjoy this one. Just the level of the acting and the back and forth. This one was a good one for me. So we're getting later into the night or earlier into the morning, whatever your perspective is. So this one was 4 a.m. in Paris when it was 7 in Los Angeles and 10 in New York. So now 7 p.m., 10 p.m. Now we're at 4 a.m. in Paris. Same time in Italy. So we move on from Paris to Italy and Roberto Benigni.
This is the showstopper.
It is.
It's in so many ways. And I know that a lot of Americans just think of Benigni as a laughingstock because of what happened at the Oscars. But for me, he's always been such a magnetic performer. I think he's such a gifted actor, not just comedically, but dramatically, obviously, if you've seen La Vida Bella. But I love him. If you've never seen Il Mostro, I think he's absolutely phenomenal in that film. He has such an insane energy. He commands your attention from the start by himself in the cab. He's just sort of doing a little kind of monologue to himself as he drives. He's talking about things that he sees and observes. And the only other actor that I could ever imagine pulling this off actually would be Robin Williams. I think he would be the only other actor who could pull this off convincingly. And this sequence, so Benigni and Jarmusch are very good friends. And again, this sequence is based largely on jokes that they told to each other as Jarmusch drove around with Benigni in Rome. And he'd stayed with him for a few months, and Benigni used to think it was hilarious to drive home going the wrong way down one-way streets. He would just look for every opportunity to go the wrong way to try to get home, going the wrong way down one-way streets. So that's part of the story. All the jokes that they told each other in the car, Jarmusch incorporates them into this part of the script. So he does say that he did script it out, and Benigni follows the script in a rough sense, but obviously he riffing. It's not improv per se, but he's sort of like riffing on what is present in the script and doing it with his very Benigni flair.
Because this is hilarious before he gets into the pumpkins and the sheep.
Yes, yes. Yes, this was not one my son sat and watched with me, but he heard me laughing. He came out and he was like, "What's going on?" I'm like, "It's Benigni."
Because like him riffing on the Hotel Genius, Beethoven, meet Charlie Parker. And he's like,
right. He's doing this whole, it's one of those things where you see those lightning fast connections happening in his brain almost.
Yeah.
It just like click, 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 click. And that's part of the joy of it and like the entertainment of what happens. But like I said, he cannot stop talking with his hands. He's just gesturing wildly, both hands off the wheel. And then of course this, like I said, is the real showstopper. So he picks up a priest, decides he needs to confess to this man while he's in the backseat.
And the priest wants nothing. And he keeps calling the priest a bishop. He's like, "I got a bishop in my car." He's like, "I'm not a bishop." He's like, "This is not the right place." "Oh, please, Father, I won't even turn around. I won't tell anybody this." And then before the priest even says, okay, he just starts.
Benigni goes into this insane monologue where he talks about like basically the first flowering of his sexuality.
And the way that he goes into it, as a young man, you feel a need for a release. A very intelligent friend came up with this idea.
And they talk about how they were young and they didn't have any girls, so they used pumpkins as a substitute. And then
and just not even stopping there, just describing the pumpkins,
Yeah, like in very, very lascivious detail. The priest the whole time is not responding. He keeps touching his chest. So obviously like he's having some chest pain. And then
he was before this even began, right? He seemed to be in some kind of state of discomfort when he first got into the cab.
And then throughout the monologue, he's taking out this bottle of pills, which clearly is a medication that he needs. And he keeps dropping the pills on the floor of the cab. So he can't get these pills. So there's like this whole separate drama that's happening in the back seat. But you're so distracted because then, of course, Benigni starts talking about how then at some point you want something warm and alive and that has a face.
That can look you in the eye.
And then he starts talking about this sheep. And it's so ridiculous. I mean, it's so ridiculous.
But it wasn't just any sheep. She was delicate. Whatever word he used, he's like, it was refined. It was delicate.
Right.
It's like the way he describes her voice. Bah. It wasn't ugly like bah.
Right. This is a special relationship that he had. And then he talks about how his father discovered, and then he goes very sober for a minute, like that was horrible. Yeah. Right. And you can tell he's remembering the moment of punishment.
He sells my Lola to a butcher. And he's describing the butcher as sweaty and nasty.
And then he goes on to start talking about his brother's wife, Monica.
Well, no, before that, he stops to say hello to the drag queens.
Oh, right. They stop to say hello to the drag queens who are prostitutes.
And he sees the couple. He stops and he admires the couple copulating against the wall, who you see at the beginning of the vignette as well.
Right.
On the scooter. And I'm thinking, what, did Agatha Christie write this story? Are they saying that this is an everyday occurrence in Rome, just to see people on the street like this?
I don't know. I've been to Rome. I never saw anybody copulating on a scooter.
I would hope not. But he stops. He's like, oh, and then the cab goes on again. Yeah.
Right. But then he starts talking about his brother's wife, right? And then
Monica, yes.
Right. This is like one of my favorite parts where he starts talking about how like her butt was like the pumpkin and her white panties were like the sheep. And then he's like, the pumpkin, the sheep, my brother's wife. Like, it's like all of these proclivities he's had that sort of combine in this one person.
Mm-hmm. He couldn't help himself because of that.
It is such an amazing, amazing monologue. And again, like he's got to keep up this sort of wild energy, throughout. And then the priest actually dies in the back seat.
Because, he drops the pills, as you had mentioned, and, they're heart pills of some kind.
It's such a dramatic result. This is the one sequence that has this sort of high drama that occurs, and then he's talks about how he's going to be blamed, for killing a priest, and he's like, and then my brother will find out about me and Monica.
Yeah, he's like, oh no. But it's like, it's more high slapstick, I think, than drama. It's very broad how he's trying to get the body out and position it on the bench so it looks like he's just resting. But going back to when he picks up the priest and that whole, the drive around the statue. Yeah. Then the priest finally gets in. I'm sorry, Father. The statue confused me. I couldn't see you. And
he's such a good actor, and this is just such
imagine being any other actor in this movie and then seeing it and seeing this scene, like, I might as well not even be in this movie.
Well, like we said, they all have their own charms, but this is
the showpiece. The
showpiece of this anthology. Like I said, I think he's such a magnetic actor. I just think he's so good at what he does. And I think more Americans should be exposed to his work and not just think of him as like the madman at the Oscars who stood on his chair. I mean, some of his stuff from Down by Laws, some of my favorite moments in any film ever. We move from this into a much more sober sequence, but very powerful in its own way.
Yeah.
So, go to Helsinki.
Mm-hmm. So now the next day is dawning, even though, again, it's the same time as everywhere else, at the same moment as everywhere else, but not the same time. We're at 5 a.m. in Helsinki.
So Mika is the cab driver, played by Matti Pellenpää, who died when he was only 44 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
How old was he in this? When did he die?
He died 4 years after this.
Wow.
Yeah. He had a heart attack. It was very sudden, very tragic. And he was a huge star in Finland, a very, very well-known actor. He's so good in this. This is a very understated part. The look on his face when he stops to pick up the three guys who are so drunk, they're using each other to stay up.
And they're asleep, standing up.
His look is just absolutely priceless. But then they get in the car, and the one guy continues to sleep, and the other two tell his tragic story of his terrible day their friend Aki has had. And he's lost his job, and then his car that he just paid off got wrecked. And then he went home, and his wife and daughter tell him that his 16-year-old daughter is pregnant. And then his wife starts screaming at him and says she wants a divorce, and he's just had a terrible day. And all this man has left is his severance pay, which his friends are apparently now going to use to pay for the cab.
Yes. And they've used to get drunk as well.
And
so this guy is unconscious during this whole exchange in the back of the cab, the one that's lost his job and has the pregnant daughter. And it's the two friends that are talking with Mika, the cab driver.
And then Mika says, well,
that's nothing. Yeah.
That's not nothing. Really a sad story. And then he tells this terrible story about how he and his wife had always wanted children, and she became pregnant, and then the baby came early, very, very early, only 6 months into the pregnancy. And then the baby was born, but the doctor kept telling them the baby's going to die. She's in the incubator, but she's not going to live. She's not going to live out the week. And then the baby kept living, but he had decided to harden his heart against this baby because he felt if he fell in love with the baby, that it would be too devastating for him when she died.
Yeah, just assuming that the baby was going to die, as the doctor was saying.
But the baby kept going. She kept living. And then finally he decided, I'm going to love this baby with all my heart, and our love will help her live. And then that very day they go to the hospital, and the baby has passed in the night. And such a terrible, terrible story.
Again, just like any other story here, it's told as a monologue. It's not like you're getting flashbacks or anything, or actually visualizing this. He's just him telling the story in the cab.
Right. But the performance is so strong. The diet and the the monologue is written so well, you do feel that you can see it happening as he's telling the story.
And it obviously affects the two awake passengers, because they're breaking into tears.
Right.
Like,
they're
this guy is a leech. He knows nothing of sorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And they're hugging Mika, and it's like they're best friends now.
Right.
It's a very sobering story, especially after what you've been through with Benini in Rome, right? So it's sobering for you as well as for them. So I think it's a great cap to the movie.
Yeah, I mean, you have to really wonder how he thought about the dramatic arc of the film. We go from this really low stakes conversation at the beginning about the casting of this film, to this extremely tragic story of this man who's lost his child at the end. And then how you think about, because even though they're little vignettes that have their own dramatic arcs within them, you still need the whole film to move towards a climax, right? And then to a denouement. So it really feels like the Benini segment is kind of the climax of the film. And
definitely.
Then it sort of like takes you down a little bit at the end there, but still has that dramatic heft so that you feel the punch of it.
I don't think any of these stories could have ended this other than this one. It just wouldn't have felt right, because this is just like almost like a coda. The sun rises as these two are walking off down the street to their own houses. Mm-hmm. And you just feel cold looking at these exteriors in Helsinki. You can just tell it's freezing here.
Yeah. Jarmusch said that at one point it was minus 25 when they were filming. Yeah. And he said the worst thing that happened on the film was that the tow broke when they were towing the car in Helsinki. And like we said before, the actors are like kind of stuck in the car because there's like of these rails that are around the car. And almost as if it was like an action film, the tow broke and the car stopped on the trolley tracks, and the actors couldn't get out of the car. So they had to like get a whole bunch of people and like literally try to push the car off the trolley tracks before a trolley crashed into the vehicle. And he said that was the craziest thing that happened.
So what's your favorite out of the 5 vignettes?
Oh, I mean,
is it? Can I ask that and say, like, besides Benini? Is that just too unfair?
Mean not Benini? Yeah. Like, let's just put Benini aside. Obviously, Benini's my favorite. I think it's, for me, every sequence does have its own charms. I do like the scene in Paris quite a lot.
I think besides Benini, again, putting him aside, I would say Paris is probably my second favorite of 5.
In a way, it's almost surprising how well this film works, considering that is an anthology film. A lot of times anthology films can feel really disjointed, but sometimes that's a product of the fact that they are directed by different directors or written by different writers, and you don't have that here. You have one guiding hand. Yeah,
it's like most anthology movies are like a roller coaster. It's like widely different, mountains and valleys sometimes. Like just looking at the Twilight Zone, the movie, how I love that John Lithgow piece at the end with the gremlin on the wing of the plane, but that far outshadows anything else in that movie. I only watch it for the ending story. But the original title of this was LA, New York, Paris, Rome, Helsinki.
Yes.
All like a run-on, which would have been very unwieldy. So it was probably a wise choice to not go with that title.
Yes, he mentioned that. That was one of the reasons why he decided not to use it. It was a little unwieldy, not easy to put on a film poster.
I know. What are you going to see tonight? LA, New York, Paris, Rome, Helsinki. Benini made that hairpin turn himself. I think it's the one. I'm not quite sure because there's a couple of hairpin turns in the Rome section. Maybe it's the one with the street sweepers, but they hired a stunt driver to do it and he couldn't do it in one take. And Benini said, well, let me try it. And he did it.
Well, because obviously he had vast experience driving the wrong way down one-way streets, apparently like a maniac. Jarmusch said there were some very frightening moments during that experience. Right.
And talking about the 2 street sweepers, those were really street sweepers that were working that night, and they came upon they saw the movie being filmed, and apparently they recognized Jim Jarmusch, and he was so impressed with this, he put them in the movie. So that's why they're in there.
Jarmusch is pretty unforgettable looking if you've ever seen him I always think of him as like the yin to Nick Cave's yang.
Yeah, he's
They're
very
about-
similar looking to Nick
They're
Cave.
He's quite tall, very thin, just like Nick Cave. He has white hair. His hair went gray when he was very young. He's actually in Straight to Hell. If you've ever seen Straight to Hell, which is one of my favorite films. In that film, he wears a white suit. So he really does look like if you stood Nick Cave in his black suit next to him, you would have a matched pair. Yeah, Jarmusch is a very recognizable human.
So what kind of buckets would we give? I know it's tough with an anthology, because you invariably like one vignette over the other. But as a whole, what do you think you might give to Night on Earth?
I think this is a 4 for me because because I'm such a big Jarmusch fan, I have to put it in his body of work. And there are other Jarmusch films that I like more. But I like this one quite a lot.
Yeah, I like it. It's 3 3/4 for me, so just below 4. So next week, Jeff will be back from Hawaii, in a manner of speaking.
Our Easter Spectacular.
Yeah, this is a very special episode, an Easter special. It is not only a book club entry, but it is also a 5-bucket special episode. And we are going to be covering The Wizard of Oz. Amazing that we have not even touched on this one yet on this show, but we haven't. So we're going to cover it next week, and all 3 of us will be here for it. So again, thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, everybody. If you like what you just heard, be sure to follow TMI Confessionals of the Nerd Kind on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or whatever you listen to your favorite podcasts on. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and then share it with your fellow movie nerd friends. It means the world to us and helps our listenership grow.
You can also find us on all of the socials, Instagram and Twitter at TMI_podcast 2018. We're on Facebook and YouTube as well. Just look for the Popcorn Bucket.
You can help support this show by visiting our TeePublic page for some TMI branded goodies such as hoodies, t-shirts, mugs, and stickers. tpublic.com/TMI Confessionals, all one word.
A 5-star review would be incredibly nice as well. I'm just saying.
Thanks again for listening. We truly appreciate you. Be sure to come back next week. We'll save some popcorn for you. You can also find us on all of the socials, Instagram and Twitter at Quitter.